Well, good morning. I think this is probably a national record. The most people ever gathered in Scotland on a Thursday to study the book of Ezra. So you are part of history being made right before your very eyes. Thanks so much for coming. I'm sure there'll be a few latecomers still on their way, just like Ezra, actually in the book of Ezra, turning up a bit late. And it's great to have you. We hope that it'll be a day of great learning, but also great fellowship. Lots of people here today, a chance to make new friends and deepen relationships with long-standing friends. It is a real privilege to have Adrian Reynolds with us. He's the Director of National Ministries for the FIEC. I knew nothing about the book of Ezra until I read his book on Ezra, and so we have a real expert with us and somebody who it will be great to learn about this great book from. So why don't I pray, and then I'll hand over to Adrian. Let's pray. Deal bountifully with your servants, that we may live and keep your word. Open our eyes that we may behold wondrous things out of your law. So, Lord, please be with us today. Please may we have open hearts, attentive minds, and eyes eager to be fixed afresh on your Son, the Lord Jesus. Father, please be with our brother Adrian. Father, please help him and empower him. Please may this be a great day where we learn much about your plans and your glory and your goodness to us. Father, be amongst us by your Spirit and do your work through your word, we pray. In Jesus' good and glorious name. Amen.
So 1999, I was sitting in my home. I was working for a pharmaceutical company. It was a Saturday afternoon. My wife had gone out and taken our two eldest daughters swimming. We had two daughters then. I've got three daughters now, but two then. And she'd taken them out swimming. And I thought, what shall I do on this Saturday, this rare Saturday afternoon on my own? I thought, I know, I'll read a book of the Bible all the way through that I don't know very well. So I got my Bible and I looked at the index. I thought, what book is it going to be? And I thought, okay, some of these books, it needs to be something reasonably short. I don't want to be overly ambitious on a Saturday afternoon. So I thought, oh, Ezra, I don't really know Ezra very well. It's only got 10 chapters. How difficult can that be? So I started reading through Ezra. Chapter 1, chapter 2, just about made it through chapter 2, all those names and numbers, and chapter 3, chapter 4, what's going on there? No idea. Chapter 5, 6. I got to chapter 7. And I got to chapter 7 and verse 10. And chapter 7, verse 10 says, "For Ezra set his heart to study the law of the Lord," depends what version you're reading, but something like this, "to study the law of the Lord, to do it, and to teach its statutes in Israel." Study, do, teach. And I sat there, and I just had this, I couldn't quite describe it as an epiphany, but I had this sudden realization that here I was, toiling away in business. I enjoyed Christian ministry, I enjoyed serving as an elder, and actually I think I'd been fairly resistant to the Lord calling me to do full-time work. And I don't want to get overly mystical about it. I think that's a very unusual situation, but I thought to myself, I need to do something about this. So that's why Ezra really captured my attention. The rest of the story, just very briefly, went like this. I thought, I looked out of my window and had a nice car on the drive and a nice house. We'd just come back from a nice holiday. I thought, I don't know how Celia, my wife, is going to take this. So I'll wait until the children have gone to bed, and then I'll talk to her. And she was putting the children to bed. Beth, and our youngest, was about 2. And she came downstairs after putting the children to bed in tears. And I said to her, what's the matter? What's happened? And she said, I was just singing to Bethan, "I will make you fishers of men." And I thought to myself, what are we doing with our lives? We should be in Christian ministry. I said, it's funny you should say that, because this afternoon I was reading Ezra, and obviously my experience is a bit more, rooted in the Bible, and not a subjective song. But so anyway, so that's my story of how I came to be in ministry. It's all centered on the book of Ezra, and it meant that I really developed a very fond affection for this book. Taught it many times. I do love it. We're not going to talk very much about this, but it's actually one of a pair in the Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah are in many Jewish Bibles and some Christian Bibles the one and the same book, Ezra and Nehemiah. It's actually one book. And you'll see as we go through it that there are lots and lots of connections. Actually, there's a chapter that's repeated in Nehemiah chapter 7 is a repeat of Ezra chapter 2. So there are lots of connections, Ezra and Nehemiah. You've probably heard a sermon series on Nehemiah. You've probably done a Bible study on Nehemiah. If you're of a certain age, you've probably sung Build It Higher, Nehemiah. They're kind of all those sorts of little songs about building the wall. But Ezra is often forgotten, and yet it has a really important part in that whole post-exile story, as we're going to see. So that's my little story about Ezra. And I hope you'll excuse me a bit of sentimentality then as we go through it today. Now, just to say before we get going, I'm going to give you the bit that normally comes at the end at the beginning. And the bit that normally comes at the end is, if I want to read a bit more about Ezra, what should I read? If I want to do a little Bible study series at church, or even if we want to do a preaching series at church, what should we look at when it comes to Ezra? And I'm going to get this out of the way so we can really spend the rest of the day getting into the text and seeing what some of the background is that will help us understand Ezra. So I think these are the three best places to go. First of all, if you want what I call a devotional commentary, do you know what I mean by devotional commentary? Basically, that's sort of sermons that have been put down on paper. Then I think Bob Files' commentary on Ezra and Haggai, which is an interesting pairing. Normally Ezra and Nehemiah, but Ezra and Haggai do belong together, as we shall see. I think that's in the Bible Speaks Today series. That's really good value. I love that. I don't always agree with Bob, but I think it's top notch, really, top quality. If you want something a bit more technical, so if you want to really wrestle with some of the things that are deep down in the text, I think the best verse-by-verse technical commentary is in the New American Commentary series, and that's by a guy called Martin Brenneman. I think that's good value. Just beware that when you get into the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, it's easy to go down rabbit holes. And actually, forgive me, we might go down one or two rabbit holes today, because sometimes they're a little bit fun, just to delve down into the rabbit hole. And by the way, just because we're going into a rabbit hole today, doesn't mean that when you run a Bible study in your church, you want to take the whole congregation down the rabbit hole. This is just to make your week of preparation go a little bit more excitedly, I suppose. But what can happen with the technical commentaries is you can get into long debates about what this word means, what that word means. Why is this number in this verse different in Ezra 2 than it is in Nehemiah 7? And some of that's quite interesting, depending on how sad you are. But some of it will just lead you astray. So you've got to read technical commentaries on Ezra and Nehemiah with a little bit of skepticism that these guys who are doing this full time, that they love a number. As we shall see as we go through Ezra, not all of it was written originally in Hebrew. Some of it was written in another language, Aramaic, which was it just means that there's a bit of extra work to do in terms of language and words and all that kind of stuff. Best book, of course, is the one on the right. It's called Teaching Ezra. I like to think, because it was superbly edited, it says down here, editors, John Gemmell. There we go. So clearly that's what made it a really super book. So if you want something that kind of tries to get somewhere between the two, how you might teach a Bible study series or how you might preach on the book of Ezra, I think Teaching Ezra is great. So let's have a read. We probably won't be able to read all of Ezra today, but we're going to read some big chunks of it. Don't make any apologies for that. There's some good stories here. I don't know how well you know the story, but it's good to get into it. And so we're going to start in Ezra chapter 1. And all through the day, we're going to read it in some slightly different ways. And the way that we're going to read Ezra 1 is this. You're going to read it to one another. So I want you, if you feel able, to find someone near you, a 2 or a 3, and I want you to read Ezra 1 to one another. Now, if you don't want to do that, if you're like me, you're a bit of an introvert and you'd rather just sit on your own, just say to the person next to you, I'd rather just read it on my own. That's fine, okay? There's no judgment here. So if you want to, why don't you find someone next to you and read through Ezra 1. It shouldn't take you too long, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll get going with Ezra. So if you've finished reading just take a moment. If you finished reading, just take a moment to say to the people you were with, what struck you about it? Okay, what struck you about that? Something odd, something familiar, something surprising, something you don't understand, something that just jumped out the page? Just a minute to answer that question. Let's just hear very short, sharp reflections as you've read chapter 1. Maybe that's the first time you've read it, maybe it's an unfamiliar passage, maybe you've read it countless times. What came freshly? Let's just hear a few things shouted out. This little block over here, who'd like to shout something out? Was Cyrus saved? Yeah. Was he used of God, or was Cyrus saved? All sorts of questions about Cyrus. Do you know, in Isaiah, Cyrus the king is given the name the Anointed One. Isaiah 45, the Messiah. So what's going on with Cyrus? You know, issuing this edict. Yeah, good question, yeah. Puzzling, isn't it? What about in this big block in the middle? I'd like to shout something out. Jerusalem. It is mentioned lots of times, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. It's the house of God in Jerusalem, the house of God at Jerusalem. Yeah. So the people are not in Jerusalem, but this is all about Jerusalem, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. Something else? Something over this side? Yeah.
Just the fact that God is fulfilling his word there.
Yeah, according to the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah. Yeah. What word of the Lord? Is there a specific word? We'll come to that in a moment. Yeah, that's right. Okay, go on.
So the mind of Exodus in the sense that
Yeah.
people who had captured them and held them captive are actually giving them everything they need to fulfill.
Thank you, yes. So they're kind of sent on their way with all these gifts. It's kind of Exodus all over again, isn't it? I think it's exactly what we're supposed to think. Yeah, what about this, the kind of the top tier over here? Smart seats. Anything over here? They're all very reserved on that side. Never mind. Don't worry. There'll be plenty of chance to redeem yourselves later. I learnt over here. Do you want to hear another good story? Nothing to do with Ezra. I learnt over here. I was converted age 12 from a non-Christian background on a crusader camp. Some of you have heard of crusaders. My parents sent me off on this camp. They didn't know it was a Christian camp. And I was sent off on this camp. And I was converted on the day that Charles and Diana were married. 29th of July, 1981, age 12. So I came home, I didn't have a church to go to, but I knew this girl, Celia, who's now my wife. She said, come to our church. So I went to this Baptist Union church, which was in Southend in Essex. The pastor was from East Kilbride, called Jim Hamilton. You know him. He used to be your pastor. How about that? So there is some kind of paradise blood in me that's been inherited from East Kilbride. So there you go. Nothing to do with Ezra, except that I'm really struck when I read Ezra about God's providence. You know, the way that God is ordaining these kind of big stories of life to bring everything together. It's kind of like me going off to a crusader camp and getting saved. In the detail, God is in the detail in these kind of big meta-narratives, isn't he? It's really exciting. You know what? For a long time, as people started getting critical about the Bible, kind of post-Reformation, into the Enlightenment, people started thinking critically about the Bible. They got suspicious about Ezra chapter 1. Because although we come to the Bible with preconceptions about God who is ruling over all things and God who is sovereign, people were reading Ezra 1 and they were saying, really? Did this really happen? You know, Cyrus, it's his first year. He's just won a big battle and he's overthrown the Babylonian Empire. It's a big battle outside Babylon called the Battle of Opis, which he won. And because he won the battle, King Cyrus was able to march into Babylon. Huge empire, massive military might. And he was the brand new king. And the previous empire had gathered people from all over the empire, including people from Jerusalem, and had kind of put them in Babylon. Daniel and his friends would have been amongst those people. And people were reading this critically and saying, would a new king who didn't really have a power base, didn't kind of have control over the whole empire, would he really have sent people back to their homeland? Would he really have done that? Would he have let them rebuild their temple, re-establish their religion? Would he really have done that? Seems highly unlikely. Surely that would just kind of foment rebellion Actually, people back in Jerusalem, they're more likely to be rebels, aren't they? They're more likely to rise up against him. It can't be true. And so that kind of reached a peak mid-19th century. And then towards the end of the 19th century, in 1879, the British Museum were excavating Babylon. Or there was an expedition to excavate around the walls of Babylon in what is now Iraq. And they discovered this. It's called the Cyrus, sometimes called the Cyrus cylinder. It's in the British Museum. Well, you think it's in the British Museum. You know lots of things have been stolen from the British Museum, right? You read about that? So I've got a copy of it. There it is. So if you go to the British Museum now and the Cyrus cylinder isn't there, you know where to look. The Cyrus cylinder, they discovered this. It's about, well, you can see how big it is because I'm holding it in my hands. It came in two halves. That's the join down the middle. And it's a bit damaged. But they started translating this cylinder. And they discovered, you can look it up online, that it said, "I am Cyrus, King of Kings and Lord of Lords." He wasn't a modest man. And he said, I'm a servant of the great god Marduk, who was their god. And there's quite a lot of puff. It's a bit of marketing, really, for a new king. It was supposed to be sent around the empire. But as you read on, as you turn the cylinder, as you read on, you discover him saying, I return to all their places, not just Jews to Jerusalem. I return to all their places, the peoples who are in Babylon. And I also return to their houses, that means their temples, the gods that have been removed. In other words, all the valuables that Nebuchadnezzar had pinched, they're to go back. Exactly what's going on in Ezra. And suddenly people were saying, oh, hang on a minute, Bible appears to be true. Shock, horror, headlines. Now, don't want to overstate it. People have analysed this in different ways. People have said, actually, this is because Cyrus was a pluralist. He just wanted people from all religions to pray for him and so on. I don't think, in answer to that question, I don't think he was motivated entirely by good and godly means. But nevertheless, it was reinforcing what was in Ezra chapter 1. And in fact, reinforcing another fact that you don't discover until Ezra chapter 5, which is not only did Cyrus let people go home, not only did he let them take all the treasures back to the temple, he paid for the rebuilding of the temple. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And that was the fact really that got historians very dubious. He might just about let people return, but he wouldn't be funding the rebuilding of basically a pagan temple. But he did, and this cylinder confirms it. About 3 years ago, people in the British Museum were translating some other tablets. They've got about 10,000 tablets in the British Museum that have never been translated. And they were translating another tablet. And they found another copy of this text. So they've now got the complete text. And it confirms all of that. Extraordinary. So there we are. Interesting information about the Cyrus cylinder that you never thought you would hear. Now, in order to get into Ezra, we need to do a little bit of the backstory. We need to know a little bit about how we got here. Now, don't worry, it's not going to be a history lesson. If you want to find out a bit more, you could read one of those other commentaries, you could read my little book, you get a lot more information. I'm just going to basically give you 3 dates, okay? So if you don't like dates, if you don't like history, just think about, I don't know, the glory of the Scottish football team or whatever else you want to do just for a moment. And I will just tell you 3 important dates that will feature heavily in the story. Okay. The first date is 722 BC. So in 722 BC, the northern kingdom, so this is not Jerusalem, this is basically everything else that wasn't Benjamin and Judah, the northern kingdom, is conquered by the Assyrians. So they went first. You remember after Solomon, the kingdom had split north and south, 10 tribes, 2 tribes, about that. And the northern kingdom was the more rebellious. They were both rebellious. The northern kingdom was the more rebellious of the two. And in 722 BC, the northern kingdom fell to Assyria. You can read about that in 2 Kings chapter 17. Now, why is that important as we think about Jerusalem? The answer is because when we get to chapter 4, those northern people make a reappearance. So there's an interesting story in 2 Kings 17. You can read through into chapter 24 as well. And what happened in 2 Kings is the Assyrians had a policy that when they conquered a nation, they would take everybody out of it and they would resettle it with a mix of all different kinds of people. Now, it kind of makes sense. If you want to conquer a massive empire, you don't want someone who speaks Hebrew talking to someone who speaks Hebrew. You don't want somebody who speaks another language talking to someone who speaks another language and getting together and ganging up on you. So you just mix everybody up, right? And if you get this melting pot of lots of different religions and lots of different languages, it's more likely to be secure. That was the thinking. So in 2 Kings 17 and through those chapters, you'll discover how the kings of Assyria, especially someone called Sennacherib, but not only Sennacherib, basically resettled the northern kingdom. So it was a mix of all different kinds of peoples, which, by the way, is the origin of the Samaritans. And that's why you get the animosity in the New Testament between Jew and Samaritan, because Samaritans had a kind of Jewish religion, but it was mixed up with other stuff. It was a bit confused, and that's the kind of the source story. So that's the first big date. All right, happy with that? Now, I'm not very good at counting backwards, but what's this? 1436. 136 years later, 586 BC, that's when the temple is destroyed. Best place to go for that, 2 Chronicles 36. We'll have a look at that in just a moment. That's when the temple is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar comes a couple of times to Jerusalem, comes on a kind of little raid first of all, installs a puppet king. That's probably when Daniel and his mates are carried off. A few years later, when the people rebelled, he comes back, there's a siege, and he finally destroys the temple in probably about 587 BC. Just a word, by the way, about dates in the Old Testament. Dates are normally measured by kings. So it's the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in Ezra 1, verse 1. And we kind of know when kings ruled from and to, but sometimes dates are inclusive. So the first year of King Cyrus is the very first year he's reigning. Sometimes it's after his first birthday. So plus or minus 1 year. All these dates, they're all plus or minus 1 year. So you can ask me any questions you like about Ezra, but please don't come and say to me, the temple was destroyed in 587 BC or 585 BC. I'll ask you to go and get another cup of tea for me. Dates plus or minus 1 year, right? So 586 BC, the temple was destroyed. The people were taken off into exile. Jerusalem was basically left empty. Not quite empty, skeleton crew. Very minimal number of people. So basically, Jerusalem was emptied and everyone was carried off into exile. Then the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, is 539 BC. Okay, 539 BC. So what's that? That is 53. Is that 53 years later? Something like that, isn't it? I told you I'm not very good at counting backwards. It's not, by the way, 70 years. Now, if you're thinking, chapter 1, verse 1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. And if you're thinking to yourself, didn't Jeremiah say 70 years for the exile? To which the answer is, yes, he did, twice, not once, but twice. And you think, well, hang on, 539 BC, 586 BC, that's not 70 years. I think the answer to that is, rather than doing some clever stuff with the maths, 70 years in the Bible is a generation. Right? The length of a man's life is how many years? 70 years and 10, 70 years. So I think 70 years in that context is probably a generation. If you really want to push it, the temple was finally rebuilt in 516 BC. But I think, reading through Jeremiah, it's difficult to argue that when he said 70 years, the exile will last 70 years, he was talking about the period of time that the temple wasn't constructed. To me, that's too much of a push. But if you want to think that, that's fine. You think that. Right, so they're the dates, right? Happy with the dates? Okay, come back from the glories of the Scottish football team. Had they won the World Cup in your minds? Yes. Now, Ezra, let's put it together, and we're going to do a little bit of work just writing on a timeline. Now, again, you might think, is this really necessary? I just want to get into the story. But actually, in order to be able to understand the story, and in order to be able to understand how the book works, I think it is useful to see this stuff. But here's a word of warning. The stuff we're doing now should never be in a sermon, or hardly ever be in a sermon on Ezra, right? In a Bible study, you've got your little Bible study group. They've come around your house. You've made them a nice cup of coffee, and you've baked them a cake. Don't give them this piece of paper and say, right, now let's work out a timeline of Ezra. Okay? This is for you doing the hard work of prep, getting to grips with the book so that you can teach it to others. It's just useful to see how the book works. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to first of all think about some kings. So I don't think I'll give you exact dates because it really will get very dull. So I'm just going to draw in very broad terms. If you want the exact dates, go and look them up. You can find them. Even Wikipedia will give you these dates. Okay? So you don't have to worry too much about knowing what they are. So in very broad terms, these are the kings who appear in the book of Ezra. First of all, you've got King Cyrus. Okay? He's basically that first block. Pretty much 540 to 530, something like that, the Cyrus. Okay? Then the next block is another king who I'm not going to really talk about very much because he's actually not mentioned in the book of Ezra. He's called Cambyses. He's the son of Cyrus. He doesn't really get mentioned. And that's because actually nothing happens during his reign in the book of Ezra. So Cyrus first, then his son Cambyses. Right? Then there's a coup. Come on, there's a coup. Cyrus is overthrown, or Cambyses is overthrown, and he's overthrown by a king called Darius the Great. Okay? And Darius the Great is all of that, or Darius the First. So he, let's say, in broad terms, 520 to 485, something like that. Sorry about this, a little bit of confusion. Cyrus, in Daniel chapter 6, is called Darius. Not helpful, is it? Probably because it was a throne name. So if you look in, here we are in Ezra chapter 1, the first year of Cyrus. When you go to Daniel chapter 6, you discover that the king that overthrew the Babylonians was called Darius. You think, oh, hang on, what's going on? The answer is probably kind of, his throne name. So that's just a little aside. Different Darius here. So Darius, there was a coup. And after Darius came another king. Let's go. He's about up to 465. Now, his name, depending on what version of the Bible you have, is either Xerxes, or if you have, as I have here, an ESV, Ahasuerus. Xerxes is a bit easier, isn't it? And if I say Xerxes, forgive me, I'm talking about, if you've got an ESV, Ahasuerus. Xerxes is how he's generally called outside of the Bible. Now, Xerxes was the son of Darius, but through his mother's side was the grandson of Cyrus. Pretty sneaky, huh? Kind of consolidating it all together, bringing the parties together. Bit of a fix, really. Xerxes, nasty piece of work. We know that from history. He had a wife called, anyone? Esther. So he is the king of Queen Esther. And after him came after Xerxes, or Artaxerxes is actually called, but that's the way I remember it. After Xerxes comes after Xerxes, and he's reigning for the rest of the time. So those are the kings, right? Now, why is it helpful to know those kings? For this reason. Let's just try and plot out where the different parts of the story happen. So this is Daniel chapter 6, that first arrow there, number 1. That's Daniel chapter 6. And that is also Ezra chapters 1 to 3. So Ezra chapter 1 to 3 happens at that point number 1. Okay? And there is a return of the people of God. And they're all listed in chapter 2. And when you get to the end of chapter 2, you discover that 42,360 people returned as part of this exodus. And they start work on rebuilding the temple. That's what happens in Ezra chapter 3. But then the work stops. Probably across that period, the work stops. So during the entire reign, really, of Cambyses, there's no work on the temple. Okay? Are you with me so far? Look happy or look befuddled. That will be a help to me. Yeah, you're looking happy, most of you. Okay. Point number 3, that is Ezra, listen carefully, chapters 5 and 6. See what's missing? We'll come back to chapter 4. So Ezra chapter 5 and 6 happens at point 3, as does Haggai and Zechariah. The book of Haggai and Zechariah also takes place at that point, Ezra chapter 3. So point 3 on my little chart. It's all quite condensed, this story. People come back, work stops, work gets going again, and 516 is the date there, number 4. 516, that's kind of the end of chapter 6. That's when the temple gets finished. By the way, with a few modifications, the same temple that Jesus would have known. This is the second temple. It did get refurbished and kind of, given an upgrade, built a conservatory on it, that kind of thing. But it's basically this temple. So the first temple destroyed, this is the second temple. So 516 BC. Right, then nothing happens in Ezra for about 70 years. And then you get to Ezra chapter 7, happens over here. It's quite a big gap. So Ezra chapter 7, and in fact, Ezra chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10 all happen there. Boof, over about an 8-month period. Now, that gap in the middle, it's not that there's nothing happening, because look who was king. So what's happening down here in terms of Bible books? Answer, Esther. The story of Esther happens there. So all these books are intertwined. So 458 BC, that's, in fact, we know a bit more precisely than that, August 458 BC is when Ezra returns. Okay, and let's just finish the little picture. Over here, pretty much, number 6, that's the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah comes at the instigation of the king. So the same king who sends Ezra in Ezra chapter 7 is the same king who allows Nehemiah to return after Xerxes. That's the same king. So Nehemiah was cupbearer to the king, wasn't he? And it's pretty clear when you read Ezra chapter 7 that Ezra was also pretty high up in the hierarchy in the Persian government. Now, what that means, by the way, is, let's have a different colour, just because we can. What that means is, in many ways, the second half of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah are kind of like part 2 of a 2-part story. So if you can, I think preaching, teaching in a Bible study, Ezra and Nehemiah together is a really good thing to do. Basically, you've got some of the same characters, you've got the same backstory, you've got the same king. You'll discover that Ezra makes an appearance in the book of Nehemiah, although it doesn't quite work the other way around. Some of the opposition is the same. So you've kind of got part 1 of the story, if you like. There it is, part 2 of the story. So part 1 of the story, Ezra 1 to 6. Part 2 of the story, Ezra 7 to 10 and Nehemiah. Now, if you're sharp, you'll notice we've missed chapter 4. So where does chapter 4 fit in? And here is the answer. Chapter 4 covers that whole period there, from the reign of Cyrus through to the reign of Artaxerxes. Now, is anybody here a history teacher? No. I'd love a history teacher. But if you like your history to be linear, chapter 4 will do your head in. Because right in the middle of the story, remember Ezra chapter 1 to 3, where does it all take place? It all takes place over here, Ezra 1 to 3. And suddenly you get, Ezra 1 to 6, all takes place over there. And suddenly you get chapter 4 in the middle of that, which covers a period of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 90 years. And we're going to talk about how that works when we get there. Right, let me just pause for breath And you can say, Adrian, I've no idea what you're talking about, or can you explain that again, or whatever you want to. Anybody want to say questions rather than comments? And unless you want to give me glorious affirmations, this is the most helpful diagram I've ever seen on the book of Ezra, things like that. So any questions about that? It's just useful to have that backstory kind of in your head. Anybody want to ask any questions about that? Good. Oh, yeah. So Malachi, we don't quite know. Thank you. It's a helpful question. I'll tell you what, let me park that question. We're going to come back to it, actually. We'll come back to it. Because there is a relationship. Yeah.
Which was your third commentary?
Which was my third commentary?
On the screen.
This wonderful one here, Teaching Ezra by Adrian Reynolds. It's published by Christian Focus and Proclamation Trust. There's another Adrian Reynolds, did you know this, who writes children's books. And he lives in Nottingham. He's a children's illustrator. And when I first wrote a book, the British Museum wrote to me, because you have to give British Library, sorry, you have to give a copy of every book that is written to the British Library. The British Library wrote to me and they said, are you the same Adrian Reynolds who wrote Harry and the Dinosaur? It was an email. And I emailed them back and I said, no, I'm not, but I don't mind his royalties. When I discovered they don't have a sense of humour. There we are. One last thing to say about Ezra. And this, at some level, this feels like really basic, but I think it is worth saying. How does Ezra fit into the whole Bible story? So here is, if you're a Cornhiller, this is kind of, you wake up in the night reciting this stuff in your memory. So for some of you, this will just kind of be, this is so basic. But just bear with me, because it is quite important, I think. How do we understand the Bible story? Well, there's lots of different ways of understanding, but let's just do it this way. It starts with creation, doesn't it? So Genesis 1 to 2. It starts with creation. And I'm doing this quite quickly because I hope this will be familiar territory. And then you get the curse. You're going to be impressed because these all begin with C. So then you get the curse, which is really Genesis 3, and then kind of the impact of that rolling out to Genesis 11, I guess. Then you get a big period of time, which is I'm calling covenant, which essentially is Genesis 12, rest of the Old Testament. We'll break it out a bit more in a minute. Then you get the time of Christ. So I'm thinking of the Gospels, really. Then you get the age of the church, Acts, the letters, going into Revelation, I think speaking to the church today. And then you get new creation new, just to keep it all beginning with C. Okay, I've rattled through that, but generally happy with that as kind of a picture of how the Bible fits together. Now, that covenant covers such a period of time that you could basically just break that out a bit more, couldn't you? And this is where you'll really get impressed, because these also begin with C. So I think it begins with call. So you've got the call to Abraham and the time of the patriarchs. So those who came straight after Abraham. Then after the people go into captivity in Egypt, are you thinking, how's he going to do this? The answer is, what am I going to call it? Came out. Stretching it a bit, aren't we? So they came out, didn't they? And someone's already helpfully shown us that there's a parallel there in the Exodus with what's going on in Ezra. Then you get the time of conquest, right? So that's capturing the land, going into the land. Then, this won't surprise you, crown, time of the kings. I guess Judges is still, kind of, Judges is that in between, the conquest, or is it crown? It's kind of moving from one to the other, isn't it? Then you get a time of captivity. We're getting towards the end of the Bible story in the Old Testament there. Now, actually, I should have put another block in there, shouldn't I? Because I've missed one. Essentially, I've missed one out. Come back. Yeah. Where are we? We're there, aren't we? We're there. So we're right at the end of the Old Testament story. So there's a big block of time where we don't know anything, but that's basically where we are. Now, that's actually going to become quite important as we think about how the book of Ezra can be taught and preached or even read as a Christian book, knowing where it fits in the whole Bible timeline. We're going to come back to that. But it is important just to see. And by the way, you would think at this point that the people of God would have learned their lesson, right? They've been through this whole thing before. They've been off into captivity. They know why, second time round, they've gone off into exile. Sorry, they know why they've gone off into exile. So you would hope at that point, come on, now you're coming back to Jerusalem. Surely you're going to get things right. And what you discover is the answer to that is, yes, they are going to get things right, and no, they're not. So they do seem to make a good start when they come back from captivity, but they basically lose it. Okay, if you want to say a bit more about that to me, and perhaps that's a new diagram to you, I'll happily point you to someone who will be able to help you over the break, or I'll come and chat to me. Right, I'm going to get you to a bit more work now, and I'm going to ask you just to test your Bible knowledge a bit. Now, if you feel at this stage, I really don't know the answer to this, just talk to someone who's wise, okay? The key to days like this is to sit next to someone who's wise, and the great liberty of days like this are coffee breaks where you can relocate to someone wiser. So you think, I've sat next to this person, they don't know anything, I'll go and find someone wise to sit next to. That's a really good strategy, I think. So what I'm going to get you to do is just spend maybe 10 minutes chatting to a friend, just kind of exploring your Bible knowledge a little bit. What is the relationship between Ezra and other Bible books? So that might be, are there any historical links? Are there any characters that are the same? We've touched on some of those already. I've given you the easy one. I've put Ezra together with Nehemiah there, so I've given you that one for free. What other connections are there? What other similarities? So you've already seen in Ezra chapter 1, hang on, something going on there with Exodus. I've already told you, actually, we've already discussed about how Cyrus turns up in Isaiah. There's something there. Ezra is not quoted in the New Testament, so don't get your concordance out and start searching for quotes in the New Testament. You won't find one. But are there similarities? Are there connections? Don't know, maybe not. See what you can explore. So I'll give you 10 minutes to do that. Have a little think. And if you want somewhere to start, here's a clue. Read the last few verses of the previous book. Okay? There we go. And what I'll do is, I know there's a lot of us, but I'll wander around, see how you're getting on, and see if any more of us have got connections going back 45 years. Together, shall we? If I don't move this, I'm going to fall off the stage, so don't do that. So let's go for some of these links. Some of you are finding quite obscure links, and that's okay. That's okay. I'll tell you why it's okay in just a moment. But let's hear what you got. So I'd love to hear from someone in the back row, because they look really wise, clever, one or two of them. So someone in the back row, what have you got? You kind of start off at, you got the first choice, so it's easy.
We're going to say Exodus.
Exodus. And what are you going to say about Exodus?
Because they come back and celebrate Passover.
Yes.
And they also, Ezra's starting to teach people the law again.
Thank you. So many links to Exodus. And I think even if you only have a very small knowledge of the Bible story, you will see those links. They come back and they rebuild a temple. And then you see all the stuff in Exodus about building the tabernacle. Okay? They come back in the second half. We'll see in just a moment. They'll come back in the second half and they rebuild the community around the law. Again, you see that in Exodus, don't you? You begin to see the law being revealed, the Ten Commandments and so on. And as you get through into the Pentateuch. So yeah, very, 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 very strong links to the book of Exodus. Yeah. So there's kind of not a quote that you say, that's the same verse that appears in Exodus. There are some quotes in Ezra from other books in the Bible, but not particularly Exodus. But yeah, the links are clearly very strong. So yeah, if you had to put, what on a scale of 1 to 10, what are the links to Exodus? You're in the kind of 7, 8 region. Okay, very strong links. Okay, great. Let's come forward one row. You look slightly. You're not quite as naughty because you're not in the back row, but you're wishing that there'd been a back row seat. So what have you got? Anybody on that row?
Esther.
Esther?
We went for the finding things in the scrolls.
Yes, thank you. So it's interesting in chapter 4, and we will spend a bit of time on chapter 4 this afternoon. In chapter 4, one of the things you have to have in your head is by the time chapter 4, the bulk of chapter 4 happens, Esther has already taken place. So back on my little timeline, just to make it even a bit more confusing. Do you remember how I drew chapter 4 across there? The bulk of chapter 4 happens there. That's where the bulk of the story happens, right on the right-hand side under the reign of Artaxerxes. So you have to read that, I think, knowing that Esther has already taken place. And Mordecai has saved the king's life, right, in the book of Esther? You know, so these aren't rebellious people in the way that you might think they are. Mordecai has saved the king's life. Esther has been a queen. She's not quite the queen mother. Artaxerxes isn't actually her son, it's a stepson. But there is a close relationship. Okay, so Esther, shall we keep working forwards, row by row? Yeah, let's do that. Next row. So third from the back. Ooh. Okay, so first temple, you can go to several places, couldn't you, for the building of the first temple? There are many similarities. Chapter 3, they use the same building material. They have the same workers. Do you know what? They start in the same month. I think that's deliberate. You get to chapter 3, you discover they started building the second temple in the same month they started building the first temple. And here's the thing, at the end of chapter 3, they sing a little song. There's a little chorus that they sing. And it's exactly the same little song they sang when they finished the first temple. So exactly right. So temple, the construction of the temple and all that sort of stuff, and where that relates here. So 7 to 8 for Exodus. Esther I'm giving a 6 to, because the story's there in the background. Temple is like a 9. Okay. Someone's going to be thinking, I wonder if I can hit 10. Okay, next row forward. Let's keep going. Yes, sir.
So, the connections with Isaiah.
Okay, tell me about Isaiah.
It mentions Cyrus as the anointed one, the Messiah of Israel. It's described in Isaiah 45:13. It says, "He shall build my city and set my exiles free."
There you go. There he is in Isaiah 45. And actually, just more generally in Isaiah, the message of Isaiah is judgment against God's people, right? Which is what the exile is. Then judgment against God's enemies, which actually is the Babylonians being defeated. That's part of it. Then there is a return. There's a highway, remember? Isaiah 35, there's a highway, and the people return. They're comforted in Isaiah 40, and the people are comforted with knowing that they're going to be restored, and there's hope for them towards the latter chapters. So I think you can get into Isaiah in the specifics, like you have, exactly right, and in the whole message of Isaiah. It's all there. So yeah, very closely linked. Okay, next row, forward. Getting to the real keenies now. This row here. What have you got?
Possibly.
You don't have to say possibly, because there are so many links. You can be confident, brother.
Ezra's disappointment with people and reading the law to them, perhaps with Moses being disappointed with God's rebellious people and bringing the law to them.
Yeah. So can I call that the Old Testament cycle? There is this constant cycle, isn't there, in the Old Testament of sin and rebellion, restoration, coming back to the law, sin and rebellion, restoration, coming back to the... And you kind of think, don't you, as you go through some of those Old Testament books, oh, here we go again, here we go again. That's exactly the same cycle that you see in the book of Ezra, where actually chapters 1 through to 6, seeing Israel at their best, and then Ezra returns, and he discovers that over the course of that long gap, 60, 70 years, it's really all gone downhill again, back to where they started. So I think that's exactly right. And Ezra as a kind of Moses figure, that the one who brings the law, who knows the law, who teaches the law. I think that's exactly right. Again, as you look over to Exodus and see the links, I think that's exactly right. You would say, oh, look, there's a Moses-like character in the book of Ezra, and his name is Ezra. Yeah, exactly right. Okay, next row forward. Revelation. Who said that? Well done. Revelation. And how are you linking Revelation in here? The return of the remnant, yeah. And a new Jerusalem, a new city, yeah. So don't forget, if we're thinking about Ezra and Nehemiah as one book, you build the temple and then you build the city, don't you? The repairing of the walls in Nehemiah is about rebuilding the city, really. And by the way, one of the reasons you should put Ezra and Nehemiah together is if you go straight to the rebuilding of the city, you miss the rebuilding of the temple, which actually is needed in order to rebuild the city. Because the temple is the place of worship. It's where the people commune with God. And so in order to have that, in order to rebuild the city, they need to have the temple rebuilt. Yeah, so I think you're exactly right, Revelation. Okay, let's just shout out one or two more. 2 Chronicles. Isn't that significant? Did everyone have a look at that? I mean, on my Bible, it's all on one page. And if you look at the last paragraph of 2 Chronicles, it's exactly the same as the first paragraph of Ezra chapter 1. Almost certainly the same author, the chronicler. 1 and 2 Chronicles are probably written for post-exile people, show them how they got to here. And it ends, 2 Chronicles, with the people being restored. And then that story is expanded in Ezra. Yeah, so very closely linked. It's basically part of that same story, really. Well, not really. It is part of that same story continuing on. Okay, keep shouting.
John 2, Jesus as the new temple.
Thank you. John 2, Jesus as the new temple. So it's not a direct link, but it's interesting that there's so much focus given to the rebuilding of the temple, and you think, we've been here before, how's this going to get sorted? We're beginning to touch, which we will do in more detail this afternoon, on how you're going to get to Jesus. And how is Ezra and Nehemiah, how are they Christian books, part of the Christian Bible? How are they proclaiming Jesus to us as believers? We're going to begin to see that. Any more? For any more? Shall I throw in Jeremiah? I'm just going to say a word about Jeremiah here. I think Jeremiah, it's a bit of a similar story to Isaiah. You could go to individual prophecies and promises in Jeremiah, especially the 70 years, a generation, the downfall of Babylon. You could go to those promises. But I wonder if verse 1 of chapter 1, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, I wonder if essentially that's meaning the whole of Jeremiah. You don't have to choose a particular verse. You don't have to say to yourself, what word is it? Jeremiah begins the words of Jeremiah. So I think in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah, it seems to me that actually it's probably the whole of Jeremiah that's being fulfilled in some way as the people return, as they rebuild. Although there are bits of Jeremiah you think, it didn't quite work out. New heart, Jeremiah 33, didn't quite work out, did it? So it kind of leaves you hanging a little bit. But I don't think you have to say, actually what's going on in Ezra is Jeremiah 25 verse 12 is being fulfilled. It is, but I think actually there's a bigger thing going on. The whole of Jeremiah is essentially, I think, being fulfilled as the people return from exile. Yeah, go on. Yeah, so that anointed language is interesting, isn't it? The language of Messiah, the anointed one. Which is actually, there isn't a king. I mean, it's one of the striking things actually about Ezra and Nehemiah is there's no longer a king. But interestingly, as we get on, there is a man called Zerubbabel, or Zerubbabel, or, who knows? You just got to sound confident, haven't you, with these Old Testament names. Zerubbabel, where does he appear? He appears in the New Testament. Anyone know where? He appears in Zechariah. Where does he appear in the New Testament? Yeah, he's part of the genealogy of Jesus. Jesus is descended from him. So actually, although the kingly line has disappeared, in the sense of kings who are anointed and crowned, the line through to the king is still very much alive. And actually, in the book of Ezra, Zerubbabel turns out to be a bit of a hero. So He'll also feature, if you know the book, in the book of Zechariah. We haven't said about Haggai and Zechariah. They're there. Haggai and Zechariah. They actually appear in person. So chapter 5, verse 1. This is lovely. I love this. Chapter 5, verse 1. Now the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. At which point you say, I wonder what they said. What was it they said that got the people building the temple? So the way they fit in the story is the temple work had stopped. Then Haggai and Zechariah are raised up. They speak to the people of God. The temple work gets restarted. And you're thinking to yourself, what did they say to the people of God that got the temple work going again? To which the answer is, know exactly what they said. Go and read Haggai. Go and read Zechariah. And this is, you get 2 for the price of 1 today, so this is a bit of an aside. But if you want to really get to grips with the book of Haggai, it's quite a short book, or the book of Zechariah, more complicated, but both beautiful books. If you want to get to the kind of heart of them, you keep thinking to yourself, these are the words that got the people building. Why? And actually, you can have that for free. That's the way to understand Haggai and Zechariah as well. What got the people building? Now, the question I set you was a bit of a cheat question, because the answer is you can list all 66 books of the Bible. Because of where Ezra comes in the timeline, because it comes here, right at the end, everything, I mean, this diagram isn't quite right, is it? In a sense, if I could have drawn it this way, I could have drawn it like this, that everything is sort of building to this great moment when Jesus comes, when Jesus dies, when he's raised to life, when he ascends to heaven, and then God's people live in Christ. That's kind of the culmination of the ages. So it shouldn't be surprising that as you get right to the end of the Old Testament story, that actually everything is pointing in this direction. So we'll do this a little bit more maybe after the break or maybe first thing this afternoon. But if you were to think of all the ways we anticipate Jesus, so many of them are foreshadowed in Ezra and Nehemiah. So it's a fulfillment of the law. That he's the temple, someone mentioned the temple. That he comes in the kingly line of Zerubbabel. That he's a high priest, a bit like Ezra was a priest. And so on and so on. And one really big one that I'm going to keep my powder dry, I'm not going to tell you about it yet. But one really big. So all of this is pointing towards Jesus. It's anticipating the coming of Jesus. And it's a bit like, you stay up during the night and you see dawn. And things just become a little clearer and a little clearer and a little clearer. And as you're walking through the history of the Old Testament, it's like staying up through the night and dawn is breaking and things are becoming a bit clearer. And then suddenly the sun rises and you say, yeah, I can see it all now. And that's basically what happens as you get towards the end of the Old Testament. That you see the coming of Christ, the need for Christ and his coming, and what he will do in just kind of, you think it's almost dawn. It's almost dawn. So in terms of the history, one way of thinking about Ezra would be saying it's basically almost dawn, which is a lovely thought to have coffee with, which is what we're going to do. Now, I'm conscious that we've only read chapter 1 so far, and we haven't really got into it. But that's basically it for background. We've got a little bit more, one little tiny thing extra to do on background. But apart from that, that is basically the background done. And after the break, I'm just teasing you, Charles. After the break, we'll get into the text, right?